Good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. Delighted to have all of you here with us on Zoom or in other online medium for another Asian Society webinar. This time we're working with an organization that some of you may not have heard of, but it's a very, very important one. It's called CAPS, Center for Asia Philanthropy and Society. I'm delighted that my co-partner, my co-founder in this effort, Dr. Ruth Shapiro, is with us here today. She is still the chief executive of this organization. In fact, it was her idea to have CAPS in the first place. And we're also happy to have Mehvesh, who is the director of research of CAPS. We have a very, very international team coming from everywhere. Anyway, CAPS is an organization which is perhaps unique in some ways in Asia. It is unique in the sense that it is really very much a research-based organization. We collect primary data, we analyze them, we make sense of them, and we learn from them. There are many, as I suppose people call me a philanthropist. I'm involved in many organizations of that sort. Almost all of them are basically for networking, which is wonderful, which is good. But there's very, very few, even in universities, that really have devoted themselves to researching what philanthropy and the social sector in general are doing in this part of the world, in Asia. How does it differ from the West? What can we learn from each other? The assumption is that we learn from the West, which we absolutely do. But perhaps there is something that the rest of the world can learn from us, or at least what is different about philanthropy and the social sector in Asia that will help us become more effective so that we can increase the quantity as well as quality of philanthropy moving forward. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Ruth Shapiro to tell us about how COVID has changed the world. COVID, as we all know, changes everything almost. And one of the things that it must have an impact on is philanthropy and the social sector. I know that some organization in which I'm involved, people are, shall we say, donations are dropping. I think we all have read articles say about some of the nonprofit organizations, cultural organizations, art organizations in New York City, who is undergoing a lot of stress, difficulties. So what about in Asia? We did a program yesterday at CAPS with Indonesia, and we're very happy to say that 8 newspapers reported on it today, and we are oftentimes called upon by governments in Asia to help them go over how can we make the social sector more effective, more contributory to society. So with that, I introduce to you Dr. Ruth Shapiro. Ruth?
Thank you very much, Ronnie. And thank you very much, Asia Society Hong Kong Center, for hosting this event, and for the Asia Society centers throughout Asia for helping to get the word out. What we're going to talk about tonight is Pan-Asian, and so relevant for the entire region. Before we get started talking about the Doing Good Index, let me just show you a brief video about it. Thank you very much. So we know today that the world faces unprecedented challenges. And we also know that the word unprecedented is used an unprecedented number of times. We know that we are facing a health crisis. We know that there's an economic crisis. We know that there's an educational crisis because our children can't go to school. So we are really facing challenges across the board. And it's a pandemic, which means that there are no white knights able to ride to the rescue of areas afflicted because we are all afflicted. We also know that the social sector rises to the occasion. And when I say social sector, I'm not just talking about the social delivery organizations such as nonprofits and social enterprises. I'm talking about philanthropy, CSR, the kinds of social investment that individuals and companies make is included in what we use the term social sector. So what has it been doing? Social sector, of course, has been providing food, medical assistance, shelter, working alongside government to allow people not to pay back their loans as quickly, doing a whole range of services and providing help, while at the same time continuing to do the work that these organizations and these sources of funds were doing prior to COVID-19. So in some ways, they're doing double duty. But we also know that during COVID-19, as Ronnie just said, the funding for a lot of these organizations has moved toward COVID and away from some of the other issues that they had been funding previously. As the video you just saw suggests, there's a lot more that can be done in Asia. And the term is, how do we unleash the amount of money that's going toward the social sector? The general sense is that in the United States, Americans spend about 2%, the equivalent of 2% of GDP on philanthropy. If Asia spent 2%, or the equivalent of 2% of GDP on philanthropy and CSR, that would be $587 billion US per year, which, as the video just said, is 12 times the amount of foreign aid coming into this region and a third of the cost of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So how can we do that? Well, when we started to think about this, we developed the Doing Good Index. The Doing Good Index really looks at the factors that contribute or hinder the flow of private capital toward doing good. What incentivizes people and organizations and companies to do good, and what holds them back? And this study now, the second time it's come out is now in 2020. It came out first time in 2018, helps us with some of those answers. The Doing Good Index gives us 3 sets of tools to think about how to maximize private contribution and maximize the role of the social sector. 1, it gives us examples of what enligning incentives can do to bring about good. 2, it mitigates the trust deficit. What can we do to mitigate the trust deficit? And let me just say, the trust deficit, the lack of trust in the social sector, is one of the issues that philanthropists cite most in terms of why they don't give more. They don't trust the organizations to receive the funding. We need to increase trust. How can we do that? And third, we need to maximize private sector investment. And we're going to talk about how we can do each of these 3 things in order to really allow the social sector to flourish and help work towards solving our shared problems. The Doing Good Index was a massive undertaking that we do every 2 years. We worked in 18 economies, so 16 countries, plus Hong Kong and Taiwan. We surveyed close to 2,200 social delivery organizations, nonprofits and social enterprises, and we interviewed 145 experts. We work with partner organizations in each of these 18 economies to collect the raw data, because it doesn't exist, to make sure it's reliable, and to really triangulate it or verify that it's accurate. And we come up with these 4 clusters. The countries that are not doing enough, the countries that are doing okay, countries that are doing a little bit better, or economies, and those that are doing well. Let me just say these are in alphabetical order because the clusters are more important than the actual order, and that the scale is on a scale of 5. No country passes a 4. So there's still, even the ones doing well, Singapore and Taiwan, can improve. And having said that, let me turn over to my colleague, Mehvesh Mumtaz Ahmed, to go through some of the more specifics.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and thank you for that introduction, Ronnie. So let me walk you through the 3 points that Ruth raised about how does the Doing Good Index show us how we can navigate the post-COVID world. What we do know is that we will need entities across all sectors to work together. We will need governments, companies, philanthropists, social sector organizations to all work towards mitigating the damage that COVID has done and the economic fallout of that is to follow. And the Doing Good Index is not only studying what is happening around Asia and what governments are doing, what best practices are, but it is sharing concrete steps that can be taken towards rebuilding a better world. So let me start with the first of these, which is the Doing Good Index shows us how incentives around doing good can be aligned. And there are 2 things that I want to discuss here. One is the importance of tax incentives and how offering the right tax incentives actually brings different stakeholders together towards supporting the social sector. And the second is how the government can actually directly work with the social sector in a win-win scenario. Now, why are tax incentives important? We know that tax deductions for giving actually exert a strong pull on how much social investment through philanthropy is flowing to the social sector. We know that. That is well documented. But there's another reason that tax incentives are doubly powerful in Asia. In Asia, institutions tend to work in tandem with government. They listen to government signals. So when the government is signaling support for the social sector through, say, 100% tax deduction for charitable giving, companies and philanthropists take note, and they are more inclined to give. So these tax deductions will help align incentives for giving and receiving by bringing in the public, private, and social sectors together. The reality in Asia is that there is a range of tax incentives that are offered. We have Singapore, which likely has the highest tax incentives, the best tax incentives in the world at 250%, which means that for every Singaporean dollar given to charity in Singapore, $2.50 of a person's income or a company's profits are actually exempt from income tax. So that's a massive tax incentive. And on the other end, we have Cambodia and Nepal, who are 2 new entrants to the Doing Good Index in 2020, and they offer either no incentives for individuals or for corporations. The good news is that most of those 15 economies in the middle are offering a 100% rate of tax deduction. So governments are signaling that tax incentives are important and that charitable giving is important. But the problem is there are 3 things that are holding back the full potential of these tax incentives from being unleashed. And these are not that difficult to fix. The first is that limits on income that are eligible for tax incentives actually hold them back. So if the income that is eligible for tax incentives is only 20% or 15%, as is the case in many economies in Asia, then the full effect of that 100% rate is not felt. The other issue that is holding the potential back is confusion. I'm sure many of you, as you're listening to me, are trying to remember, okay, what are tax incentives? What are tax deductions? That's part of the confusion. They're not that easy to understand. Many economies find them difficult to claim for donors. But more interestingly, 14 out of 18 economies, the experts that we interviewed in those economies themselves were confused about them. So the regulations around this are just not clear to begin with. But let's look at the other way that incentives can be aligned, and that is through government working directly with the social sector to provide social services. This is important for a number of reasons. One, it awards legitimacy to social sector organizations. Two, it encourages their growth. And three, if both the government and the social sector organization are playing to their comparative advantage, it's a win-win and the most efficient way of delivering that service. So we see this already happening in Hong Kong, for example. The Tung Wah group of hospitals has been contracted out by the government to provide healthcare in Hong Kong. We see government procuring the setting up of schools or teacher training from the social sector. In COVID, we have seen the government outsourcing sometimes the delivery of food to the social sector or the coordination of quarantine centers. So we know that procurement works. What is, again, a little worrying is that we do see the trend of procurement declining a bit between 2018 and 2020, and we would like to see this reversed. As you can see, from the slide, China and Bangladesh have the highest incidence of government working together with the social sector, whereas Thailand and Myanmar have the lowest. But if anything, we know that COVID is likely to increase the imperative for these kinds of partnerships because the needs are continuing to grow, and both government and social sector and others will have to come together to meet these needs. The second way that the Doing Good Index is showing us how to chart the path forward is by mitigating the trust deficit. As Ruth mentioned, the trust deficit can really hold back investment from flowing into this sector. And this is where regulations can help, and so can companies. Regulations can absolutely help build trust by mandating transparency and accountability. And the good news is that in Asia, we do see this mandate in place in most economies. Most social sector organizations are required to submit annual accounts and annual reports. Their leadership is also held liable for non-compliance, which is great. But the thing to remember about regulations, and this is where I'd like you to draw your attention back to the slide, is that they can have unintended consequences. And the approach to enabling regulations has to be a balanced one. If you look at this slide, you'll see that a quarter of the average budget of a social delivery organization actually comes from foreign funding. At the same time, even before COVID hit, in 10 out of 18 economies, foreign funding was declining. In 6 of those, because of regulations. And in these economies, we saw that the vast majority of social delivery organizations were looking towards domestic donors. And those that were unable to plug the gap, according to the data that we found, were thinking of cutting back on social services. So regulations are critical in building trust, but at the end of the day, on balance, they have to be enabling, and unintended consequences have to be taken into account. And this is why the Doing Good Index, which is showing us how to really encourage and pull domestic philanthropy, is even more critical, because foreign funding is declining, because governments are more wary of it to begin with. How can companies help? Companies can, of course, help by directly funding social delivery organizations, which is great. But they can also help build trust in the sector when they engage with social delivery organization. Again, it signals to donors and to the public that this organization is trustworthy if a well-known corporate is going to engage with it. And companies are doing that. We see that in over half of the social delivery organizations that we surveyed, they're hosting corporate volunteers who bring important expertise and technical skills to the table, IT or legal services, financial advice, fundraising expertise. We also see that 3/4 of social delivery organization boards actually do have corporate representation. Again, they're bringing their corporate expertise and governance practices with them, which is great. Where is there room for improvement? We are seeing that on nonprofit boards and governance, we're not yet seeing as many women as we would like to. So women tend to make up half of nonprofit staff, but only 2 out of 9 board members on average. And that is, again, something that maybe companies can help with. Now, the final way in which the Doing Good Index is showing us how to maximize the potential of the social sector and really chart the path forward in a post-COVID world in which there is no doubt that the social sector will have to play an increasingly important role, is by showing us how funding to the sector can be maximized and how the time for that is now. And we've already talked about what governments can do. We've talked about how companies can help. But the social sector itself can also take matters into its own hands. It can, one, build trust by being more transparent and accountable. And we see that in Pakistan and the Philippines, for example, where self-certification agencies have been set up so that donors have something to look at when they are trying to gauge whether an organization is trustworthy or not. Social sector organizations can leverage public-private partnerships, and we'll talk more to that in a little bit. It's not easy to do, but we are seeing that governments across Asia do like engaging the social sector in policy consultations, which is a positive sign. How can we change that, leverage that into public-private partnerships is actually our next project, and we can talk more to that if there is interest. And finally, social sector organizations can leverage technology. They can maximize the use of technology. And again, in encouraging finding, we see that social sector organizations are leveraging social media, engaging with local media, and turning to crowdfunding. The Indonesia webinar that Ronnie mentioned, one of the panelists there told us about how during COVID, their online donations have jumped to 80% of their budget as opposed to 30% before. So social sector organizations are figuring out how to make this new reality work for them. And I'll just quickly hand back to Ruth for a final word.
Thank you, Mehvesh. This is a call to action, and as Mehvesh just said, there's a role for all sectors to play. There's a role for governments. They can improve regulations, taxes. They can signal support for the social sector through taxes and by procurement. There's a role for businesses, absolutely, funding, skills transfer, engage in partnership. And there's a role for social sector organizations, nonprofits and social enterprises. So many come to us and say, oh, our funding is going down, what can we do? And the answer is, you need to tell people why you're a good destination for their hard-earned money. What are you doing to maximize the impact? How can supporting you help the community? So social sector organizations can engage with government and corporates and do a lot to build trust. Unfortunately, in the social sector, nonprofits and social enterprises are often guilty until proven innocent. So we need to prove that we're worth the investment and that we can be really important partners in building a post-COVID world. So thank you very much, and now to our conversation with Ronnie. Oh, and let me just say one thing. All of our information, the Doing Good Index, and all of our reports is available through our website, www.caps.org, and we have a lot of other information there as well, so please do visit our website and engage with us through it. Thank you, and thank you. Ronnie, please go.
Very good. Thank you, Ruth and Mehvesh. You mentioned about the trust deficit. I think that is something that came out from our first edition of the DGI in 2018. I don't think that, I assume that some of the participants here are not aware of our first edition. So can you say a word about the DGI? What are the key findings from the first year that we did it?
Yeah. So actually, the notion of a trust deficit came even before the Doing Good Index, because we interviewed, we did a number of case studies of nonprofits and social enterprises around Asia, and we interviewed about 80 high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals, and we asked them, why don't you give more in Asia? And across the board, from Korea to India, the number one answer was because we don't trust the local organizations to receive the funding. So we thought, we want to work at a system level. What can we do to increase that trust? And we realized that regulations actually can help a lot. So that regulations can force, in effect, more accountability and more transparency. So the Doing Good Index was a response to our finding that trust is a big problem in Asia, and because people tend to rely on their relationships, which is great, but you don't necessarily have relationships with all the right organizations, and you don't have the wherewithal to go out and kick the tires of every organization out there. So we need some mechanisms to really allow for more due diligence and more system-level approach to increasing trust, and that was why we did the Doing Good Index and a finding from the first DGI. Do you want to add to that?
Yes, can I add to that? The trust deficit is nefarious, it's harmful. We saw that in the economies that had witnessed front-page scandals related to the social sector. A third to a half of social delivery organizations were reporting a fall in funding as a direct result. So it has a very harmful impact. Another interesting finding that we had in 2018 that remains true in 2020 is that when we ask these organizations, do you think you are trusted by the communities you operate in? They overwhelmingly say yes. The vast majority of them are doing great work. Part of the issue is that the people who know that they are doing great work are localized in those communities. And that story is not getting told at a national level. It's not reaching the ears of donors and philanthropists and companies.
Are you suggesting, Mehvesh, then, unlike in the West, where you have some big nonprofit organizations, does it mean that in Asia, most of the trusted ones are the local community, smaller organizations, and there has not been too many big organizations that has caught the attention, shall we say, of all the philanthropists?
No, that's not what I'm saying. There are big organizations that are trusted, but trust as a general concept seems to be much more pervasive and prevalent at the local level amongst communities that are aware of those organizations. At the national level, the organizations that are big, that have a bigger footprint, or that have been established and running for a long time, tend to be the ones that people are aware of and trust.
I would add to that and just say, in every Asian economy, there are, in effect, a few blue chip nonprofits that everyone says, oh, that one, that's a good one, that are essentially known and widely supported.
Like Community Trust in Hong Kong, or
Community Chest.
Chest
That's
in Hong
right.
Kong, right.
And that's right. Community Chest is a good one. Asia Society is a good one. St. James Settlement is another one that everyone says, yeah, that one I know. But it makes, so people are comfortable giving to those organizations, but it makes it much harder for anybody else to enter. The barrier to enter is higher, and those organizations often don't work at the very local level.
Okay, but then you are really fighting against a pan-Asian phenomenon of low trust. Now, there are obviously noted exceptions like Japan, which is very, very different. But the rest of East Asia that I have been doing business in is always low trust. And so how do you overcome that in order to make sure that the social sector and the SDOs, the social delivery organizations, become more accepted and more trusted by the donors?
Well, it's not just that. I mean, yesterday in our discussion in Indonesia, one of the big complaints that was voiced by several of the panelists was the government itself is corrupt in many cases. So some of those government officials create nonprofits to, in effect, play the system. And that is not, unfortunately, limited just to Indonesia. So I think that donors want more transparency and accountability so that they can navigate and also have a way of dealing with the multiple pressures that they face. So it's not so much finding the good organizations so that you can help an issue you care about in health or education environment. It's also responding to the pressure that you might get from government, from other partners, and saying, well, I want to be able to do my due diligence, and I need systems in order to do this. So I would say that our work on the Doing Good Index, one of the reasons it's widely supported by donors in Asia is because they see the value in creating more systemic ways of approaching due diligence beyond their immediate relationships.
Mehvesh?
Yeah, if I could add to that, it would be that, with a solution maybe, which is that information is king. A lot of the lack of trust, whether it's between companies and government, or between the public and government, or the social sector and donors, is because there's just not enough information out there. And the solution to that is multifold. And the Doing Good Index actually talks about all of them. One is that the government can mandate annual reporting, as it does for listed companies. The issue is that the government mandates it, say, in Sri Lanka and in actually most of the economies that we look at, but then that information goes and sits in a vault somewhere. It is not made public. So the next step is, please make it public. The second thing here is, the strategy here is that social sector organizations themselves have more agency than they might think. Spruce up your websites, put more information out there. Even if your annual report is being submitted to government, make it public on your website. And the third thing I would say is that donors can also have some agency here. They can also make an effort to do their due diligence and to demand more information.
Okay, this is the second time that DGI comes out. So DGI is only 2-year-old.
Right.
And do you think that DGI can help governments or help societies in which we operate do a better job? Are we making an impact?
So as we were discussing earlier, COVID has not created any new problems, but it's accelerated trends that we saw going forward. And so trends in the need for local funding, trends in the need for more collaboration at the community level, complex problems that need the government, the private sector, and the social sector to work together more collaboratively. That was all true. I think that the good news is that we've been asked by governments throughout Asia to come and talk to them. The comparative nature of the DGI is a little bit helpful here. I know in Hong Kong they say, why are we in this second group? We should be in the first group. So the competitive nature of governments can be put to play here and in a good way. And we're not criticizing anyone. We're just saying there's some low-hanging fruit that can allow us to work together more effectively and allow these funds to be used more efficiently.
Another thing that makes the Doing Good Index and its impact quite unique is that we have ownership from each of the economies that we cover. We work with local partner organizations to gather the data, to do the analysis, and then to help disseminate that messaging after the Doing Good Index comes out. And we build their capacity in the process. We're talking about big organizations, either that are such as the Association of Foundations in the Philippines or universities in other economies. So we are working very closely with local partners who would then really own this research and want to take it and push it to donors, push it to governments.
And let me just also, you don't know this yet, Ronnie, but Myanmar was at the bottom, in the bottom category in 2018, and in 2020 it moved up one category. And when it came out, the Minister of Social Welfare in Myanmar tweeted about it, that yes, Myanmar has moved up in the Doing Good Index.
Very encouraging.
Yeah, it's very encouraging because, there's a lot of potential to do better in Myanmar.
Okay, you all mentioned something about funding, a lot of foreign fundings, and it has been decreasing. Does that decrease have anything to do with COVID? Or do you think that it is already happening even before COVID?
It was already happening before COVID, and it's a combination of several factors. One is Asia is getting wealthier. And so a number of donors, be they foundations or aid agencies, are saying, well, why should we help Vietnam or Indonesia? They're now middle-income countries. Let's move to poorer countries. So that was happening. Also, there's a number of governments in this part of the world that are saying, we don't want foreign money because it comes with political strings attached that we're not interested in. So we believe we can generate local support. So there are
Bangladesh, China, India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Vietnam have put in place extra scrutiny of foreign funding that is actually dampening foreign funding flowing in. And some of them, like China and India, have also put in place regulations, such as the charity law in China to encourage domestic philanthropy, and the 2% CSR law in India to encourage corporate philanthropy in order to make up the gap.
Right. So I think that governments across the region are saying, we also want local funding, and we're going to help to decrease the reliance on foreign funding and try to build up. But as of now, that delta hasn't been bridged. So there is a shortfall.
Do you think that could eventually be make up, that the local donors will one day become even more, or will become as generous as some of the foreigners who have been helping Asia?
I refuse to believe that there's any one nationality that's more, that has more humanity than another nationality, or is more compassionate or more generous. I think that is a human tenet, and we just need to enable it to a certain extent. So absolutely, I mean, the point of the Doing Good Index, the ultimate goal is to unleash that $587 billion from Asia to Asia.
Is there any estimation on how much is the total amount of philanthropic dollars in Asia? It's hard to.
Short answer, no. And if there are claims that there is, then please look into how that number was computed. No, even in the West, philanthropic donations are computed through whenever there's a paper trail. So in the US, for example, there are tax filing is one way to track philanthropic donations. That is not the case in Asia, either because tax collection is poor, or because tax incentives are so low that people are not actually claiming those deductions. So paper trail in Asia, most Asian economies, of philanthropic donations does not exist. At best, we have estimates.
But we do know, Ronnie, that it's far below 2% of GDP, and that we have a long way to go.
Do you think that we're at 1%? Sorry to press you for...
No, that's okay. Maybe for some economies, but I'll also add here that economies also tend to confuse charity with philanthropy. So Asians are a very charitable bunch. Asian countries tend to top the Charities Aid Foundation's World Giving Index, which looks at basically how charitable a random person has been in the last 3 months. So Asians are a charitable lot, but philanthropy and social investment is about systemic, large-scale investment into meeting societal needs. Those numbers are really not tracked or even made public sometimes.
But I will say, and it's not that this is should be the model for everyone, but India did put into place 5 years ago CSR legislation that requires about the top 18,000 companies to give 2% from pre-tax profits. And everyone thought there'd be this wild outcry from the business sector. In fact, the business sector has somewhat embraced this and gotten on board and integrated this 2% into their business strategies in a very positive way.
Are there other countries who, without the government legislating, but still the corporates are very philanthropic, that, I don't know, 1% or whatever of their top line, bottom line every year is given out? Are there such countries?
There's some companies that have signed on voluntarily to 1% groups or alliances. I would say that there's extraordinary societal expectations for companies to step up. And that is very true in COVID. And either many of them want to and others are being shamed into it. So there's a number of governments that have come out and named and shamed those that aren't doing enough. Thailand, the Prime Minister's office actually listed the top 20 wealthiest Thais and said, you should all be doing more, and they have all stepped up. In the Philippines, in India, in other countries, they have been named by the head of state, certain companies for not doing enough. So I think there's going to be increasing pressure for companies to essentially work with nonprofits and work with government to provide these services.
There's a lot of questions here, so let me go to some of them. One is, I'm sure there's a difference between volunteering your time and expertise versus actual money, dollars. Are there particular, do you have observations on the interplay between the two? Are there some countries that are particularly, people volunteer a lot more? Whereas, although they may not be big in dollar amount of giving, but nonetheless, people volunteer their time.
We looked at corporate volunteering, and the 51% figure, that 51% of social delivery organizations across Asia are hosting corporate volunteers is already an impressive figure. That there is great engagement through volunteering between social sector organizations and companies. And by the way, most economies actually fall way above the average. So they've pulled it up, and a few fall below it. So in most economies, it's happening quite a lot. We're also seeing the rise of some coordinating agencies that can help match social sector organizations to companies so that the expertise that is flowing is more purposeful and purposive and will achieve a better impact. So we're seeing almost an industry arising around making this volunteering more impactful, which signals that there is enough of it in quite a few economies.
And it's very hard to know exactly what the bang for your buck is when it comes to CSR. So how does CSR help a company? How to increase volunteerism help a company? It's hard to put a dollar amount, but the one area where we know it helps is with employee happiness and tenure. So companies that have robust volunteer programs and CSR programs have happier staff and employees who stay longer. People want to feel good about their company, and these kinds of programs are a very serious mechanism to allow them to do that.
No wonder so many of my Hang Lung staff are so happy, because we do encourage volunteering a lot.
Yeah.
Here's a question on generational differences. Do you see differences between the older generation who perhaps are the entrepreneur that started companies versus the children who are now running the business or soon to run the business? Are there such observations from your research?
Okay. There's a lot of, most people say that the younger generation cares more about return on investment and impact. And I know that that's essentially a rule of thumb that's out there in the world. How that's measured, I'm not so sure. But I also know that the younger generation does seem to care about climate change particularly more, and this notion of giving back and service. So how that manifests itself in their philanthropic decision-making, it's still a little early to tell, but there's a general sense that there will be a change of the kinds of programs, and that right now, education is the biggest destination of all philanthropy in Asia. There may be move toward environmental issues as the generations move.
We did ask, actually, in our survey whether the social sector has observed a difference between the older generation, the original generation of philanthropists, and the younger generation. And the consensus was that the younger generation is at least as committed. Beyond that, the degree we cannot speak to. But Ronnie, we have done other work that speaks to how the younger generation is approaching social investment. And we noticed two things. that they are more risk-taking when it comes to choosing their own careers. So they are more willing to work towards a cause, to not just be working to turn a profit. And that's one thing. And we do see around Asia some innovative foundations or other initiatives in meeting social needs being set up by the scions of some business families. So we are seeing that. The other way where we see the younger generation being more risk-taking is that they are looking at different kinds of organizations to invest their, to repurpose them into vehicles for their social investment. So not only nonprofits, but also social enterprises, which are organizations that can be either for-profit or non-profit, but that are using business operations to meet social need. And we're seeing the younger generation really turn to that, both in providing talent to it, to a social enterprise, founding a social enterprise, or being willing to fund it.
You know, I find it interesting. I don't know if my observation is confirmed by your research, and that is there are some countries where somehow it has built up a culture where it is kosher, shall I say, for young people to devote some time to volunteer their time. And some countries tend to have a lot more young people founding nonprofit organizations. I wonder, why is that the case? For example, Philippines. It's I don't know if the philanthropic dollars are necessarily big, but it seems to me to be a very active community where a lot of people, young people, seem to be very much involved. Is that correct, and why, if so?
I think that there's two factors that are generational difference. First of all, Asia has extraordinary wealth now, but that's a recent occurrence, right? So your generation really had to care about bringing, putting food on the table and a roof over one's family's heads. So the next generation has some ability to make choices that are not survival or immediate survival mandated. And the second is this notion that government is going to solve your problems. I think that there's and COVID-19 has, I would say, accelerated this. In a number of countries, government has not been able to solve all the problems. And so therefore, look around, who's going to do it? So it then becomes incumbent on communities, on individuals, and on companies to step up where government cannot play the entire role.
There's another question here about, sorry.
No, that's okay.
There's another question here about talents. I know how much these two young ladies are paid, and I am pretty sure that if they were to work in a for-profit organization, they would be making a lot more money than what they are paid by CAPS.
I guess I'm off then. Bye.
So do you attract enough good talents? Is that something that is changing to the better or to the worse?
There is a massive talent gap in the social sector. The ability of nonprofits to pay their employees well is really not in their control half the time. It's in the control of donors, and unless donors are giving funding that is not tied to a particular project, or they are earmarking it for capacity building, it is unlikely that nonprofits can actually pay people what they deserve for that work. And so it's no surprise that recruiting and retaining talent, and we have questions around this in the survey, around 90% of the organizations say that both are hard. Recruiting and retaining skilled staff, general staff, it's all hard. So there's a big turnover in the social sector. And as you can imagine, social sector organizations are not doing easy work. They're doing complex work. So when the talent keeps turning over, it does slow them down. So absolutely, because of lack of pay, and in some conservative societies, the association, the perception that nonprofit staff should earn less than their for-profit counterparts, it's almost a social tax. And again, this is prevalent across Asia, hinders the ability of nonprofits and other social delivery organizations to attract and retain people.
But having said that, our study also looks at how many universities teach classes on nonprofit management, on social entrepreneurship, on philanthropy. And you may remember the specifics, Mehvesh, but I know there's been a dramatic increase in those classes being taught. And that's a sign that there's demand for those classes.
Yeah, I think we've gone from a 400 plus universities in 2018 to 600 plus in 2020.
In Asia alone?
In Asia, absolutely.
Very good. What about the matter of scalability? A lot of these, social delivery organizations in Asia, do they pay much attention to scalability, such that what works in one country may be able to work in other countries? What works in one community, one city, can work in many cities in the country? Is that something that you are seeing, or is it very much still people are just hunkering down and doing what they do best in the local community?
Well, I have opinions about this that are not necessarily universally accepted.
You can feel free to share. You have a lot more expertise in this than most people.
So there has been a lot of focus on scale, and that is a term that is used widely and by many donor agencies. One of the aspects that we see in Asia is that, for the most part, philanthropists like to fund local. They feel more connected to their communities. They feel that they understand the terrain and the players, so they can be more effective and impactful. And frankly, they want to enhance relationships that they care about, which tend to be where they're operating.
Which may be good for the business, which is fine.
Right, that's fine.
As long as it's above board.
Right. So sometimes they take ideas from one place and try to, plant them, but just having a cookie cutter approach and going for scale for the sake of scale tends not to resonate. And I would say that one of the absolute trends that we see during COVID-19 is local, 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 because everyone is affected. So what's happening? This is really the response to COVID-19 is at the local level, the village level, the city level, where you've got collaborations with local governments, local companies, or the representatives of larger companies, but local, and grassroots organizations working together to really supply frontline needs. So I think that probably that trend to kind of go local and collaborate locally, my gut feeling is that will continue in a post-COVID world.
Since your DGI Doing Good Index, the second edition just came out. So that means you did your research in the last 6, 9, 12 months. And the last 7, 8 months coincided with COVID. What are the best things you have seen done during COVID that social delivery organizations are doing? Are there some new ideas?
Well, we do
and then
have
the next
answers
question
for
is,
that.
what can they contribute after COVID? So, but let's go to what can they do during COVID, or what have they done during COVID?
I think at a very broad level, Ronnie, they are continuing to do what they have always done, which is endeavor to help the communities that they're working in, to provide education, to make sure no one is left behind. But most importantly, in COVID, we're seeing this awareness of the most vulnerable. And that is the social sector's wheelhouse. It has always worked with the most vulnerable. So part of what they've done is continue to work with the most vulnerable. And when COVID first hit and spread like wildfire, when everyone was scrambling to decide what to do, the workers often at the front line, in addition to health workers, were social sector workers who had access to households, communities, people who were sleeping on the streets, and who could actually bring them in and help them. So one answer is they're doing what they have always done, and they are, if anything, stepping it up during COVID. We're also seeing that organizations that had a heavy online presence, to begin with, or that were able to leverage technology before COVID in order to deliver a social service such as online courses, are less affected by COVID.
In fact, they're flourishing.
In fact, they are flourishing.
Yeah.
And those that were able to pivot to somehow meeting some of the needs of COVID, either by manufacturing PPEs, and we saw this in social enterprises, or sustainable fashion companies moving to making cloth masks, or 3D printing social enterprises turning to making parts for ventilators. So we see a lot of pivoting and innovation in response to COVID. So we're seeing a multifaceted response, but let's also not forget that we are seeing a threat to COVID as a massive threat to the sustainability of these organizations and their longevity. In Hong Kong itself, nonprofits, I think about halfway through the year, said that 30 to 70% of their funding was impacted. A quarter of social enterprises in Malaysia and in Hong Kong are not sure how they will ride this out. So on one hand, we are seeing them do what they do. We are seeing governments and companies working with them because they know that these guys can deliver and reach the right people. And on the other hand, there is also an existential threat to them that we all need to be aware of.
COVID-19 has had somewhat of a zero-sum effect, right? Because philanthropists have pulled their funding from other things in order to provide PPE, build hospitals, provide healthcare. So hopefully the funding will not dry up and donors will realize that they need to, in effect, double down rather than withdraw, even though they themselves are suffering economic hard times. But I just want to pick up on one of Mehvesh's points that gives me the most hope. In country after country, it is the most vulnerable that are most affected, and we could live by not paying attention to those people to a certain extent in the past, but now we realize that we are all living together and we are living, in integrated lifestyles. And so it is incumbent on everyone to care about the other person, and I'm hoping that that's a lesson that will come out of COVID and still be at play when we're all healthy again.
One last one or two questions. What will happen after COVID to this whole sector? Some, sorry to say, organization may be gone. Funding is dried up. But for those who are remaining, or for the bigger ones who can survive, what do you think the main contribution can be in these affected countries?
Many people think that society is somewhat of a three-legged stool, right? You've got the government, the private sector, and you've got the social sector, nonprofits, and other types of social delivery organizations. But we need to work together. There's a notion of something called a wicked problem, and a wicked problem is one that's extremely complex, and no sector by itself can solve the kinds of problems that we have today. And so I'm really hoping that this crisis does allow us to figure out which of those collaborations are more effective, to pull from the strengths of each of those sectors and work together. This is a fork in the road, and I hope we take the right path and figure out ways in which we can work together and collaborate going forward.
This is a good place to end, but nonetheless, here's one question that I really like to know the answer myself. So please indulge me. Do lower income tax rate result in higher level of philanthropy? Do they trickle down? Does generosity trickle down? Lower tax rate countries have higher level of philanthropy. Is that true?
Lower tax deduction or just tax rate?
Just lower income tax rates.
We haven't seen evidence of that. Actually, the flip would be that do countries which have higher tax rates see lower levels of philanthropy? There's no evidence of that.
Either. Okay, so it is really what tax benefit you get rather than what is the tax rate per se, the absolute level of tax rate.
Well, it's one of the factors.
One of the factors.
The tax benefit that you get is one of the factors that will help push social investment.
Very good. Thank you very much. I think we have to end. This is a wonderful discussion. I encourage all of you, if you are interested in the topic and want to discuss with Dr. Ruth Shapiro and Mehvesh Ahmed more, feel free to write to us. I think that you can have the information of our email or whatever, and be sure to write to us and find out more about the good work of CAPS and how to bring the social sector in Asia forward. I think this is a very exciting thing. I think Asia would do okay in the coming years and decades, and some of the countries will do quite well. And hence, the growth of the social sector can be expected, I think, in spite of the problem that COVID presents. But at the same time, it also can stimulate more activities of this sort, which is to the betterment of Asia in general for the long term. And never know, maybe one day we can have something more to contribute to the rest of the world. To what we do here may be very useful for other parts of the world as well. So thank you very much, Dr. Ruth Shapiro and
Thank you.
Mehvesh. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ronnie.